Here are two true stories from Reddit of scary encounters in the streets of Europe. Enjoy. Number 1. When I was 13, my mother and I were doing some traveling throughout Italy. We love architecture, and European architecture was fascinating to us. One of our days of sightseeing was spent in the city of Naples. We spent the day touring around in the city center, visiting the sites, malls, shops, and cafeterias. With the end of the day approaching, we decided to take one last quick little walk around a few more blocks. We were walking through what seemed like a nice and decent neighborhood right next to the city center when we took a wrong turn. The previous slightly crowded street had turned into an empty and somewhat eerie one, and we realized very quickly that we should turn back. While making our U-turn, we happened to glance down another street and saw a woman being held down at knife point by two fairly large men. She was struggling and trying to scream as one of the men had her pinned down in his hand over her mouth. The men didn't notice us at first, but the woman did. She looked at us with desperation in her eyes, and both men simultaneously turned their heads in our direction. One man jumped up and started running right for us. We started to run as fast as we could. We had been wandering around the city the whole day and were exhausted. Me, being only 13 years old and on my last legs, had to basically be dragged alongside my mother as she ran. The man reached us quickly and soon grabbed me by my free arm. His grip was so strong and sudden that I wanted to cry out in pain, but I held it in. I turned and looked at the man. His skin and hair were oily, and he smiled the most sinister smile I had ever seen. He tried to separate me from my mother and began tugging me in the other direction. My mother started screaming at the top of her lungs, which threw him off guard. He stopped for just a second, just long enough that my mother slammed her foot on top of his and tore me away from him. Now we ran and ran faster than ever before until we reached the crowded streets. We made our way into the mass of people walking about. The man had continued pursuing us until he realized there were just too many people around. We ran until we finally reached our hotel and tour guide. My mother explained what just had happened. Unfortunately, us being in a completely new city and in such an extreme situation, we had no idea about the exact location where this had happened. There wasn't much to report to the police about these two men and that poor woman. I truly hope the woman somehow got away and survived, because I doubt my petite mother and my 13-year-old self could have done anything against those two dangerous men. Number 2. A few months ago, I was visiting a friend in South London and was walking to my car, which was parked a few streets away. Walking past a train station, all of my attention was focused on my phone as I was replying to a text message. Suddenly, this disheveled-looking man standing directly in my path put his hand over my phone to get my attention. Before I could react, he started asking and begging for money so he could hail a taxi. I apologized because I couldn't offer him any money. Plus, I never carry cash on me, only cards. He kept rambling on, telling me he was fresh out of prison and knows the type of person I am. I continued being polite and apologetic, but he wasn't listening to me at all. Then he started shoving his hands down my jacket pockets, and suddenly I snapped. I started yelling at him and pushing him away from me. This made him even more crazy as he started grabbing at my waist, trying to dig into my trouser pockets. Luckily for me, two men stepped out of the gathering crowd and pulled the crazy man away just as he shoved me back. I tripped over my own heels and fell flat on my arse. We both traded a few insults at each other before the man broke free and walked off, disappearing from my sight. The altercation must have lasted only a few minutes, but it felt much longer. I was very upset and so overwhelmed by anger that it took everything in me not to cry. I wasn't going to let the action of this horrible man get to me. I composed myself and made my way to my car, got in and started heading home. Little did I realize there was more trouble to come. I was driving down the road and had slowed to a stop because of the line of unmoving traffic in front of me. The vehicle just ahead of me was a large van, and it was completely blocking my view of the rest of the road. Plus, I didn't know why, but all the cars in front of me were sounding their horns. Then the van ahead of me decides to pull out and get into the other lane. Now I finally see what was causing the traffic jam and all the commotion. That same man who was harassing me 15 minutes earlier was walking in front of me down the road. I drove slowly behind him, just praying that he wouldn't turn around and cause any more problems. But then he came to a stop and just stood there in the road, motionless. I stopped behind him and had nowhere to go. The other lane was busy and I didn't want to get this man's attention. Then the cars behind me started honking. The man turned around, probably thinking I was the one honking at him, and ran right at my driver's side window. My window was cracked open a few inches from me having a smoke to calm my nerves. He was swearing and trying to spit at me through the gap in the window. Then he tried grabbing at me, so I took my cigarette and put it out on his hand. This made him jump back, and with him out of the way, the road ahead of me was clear. I quickly floored it and took off. After I had driven a little ways, I called the police and reported that a lunatic was causing trouble in the road. The officer took a description over the phone and told me a few people had called in about the situation. The entire drive home I kept imagining the argument over and over again, and I was so angry at myself for not punching that guy in the face. I just hoped that in the future, I'd be able to stand up and defend myself against creeps like that. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed. Until next time.